What is up, guys? This is Tcg Sam here, and in today's video I'm coming at you guys with my initial thoughts on what the February 2022 meta is going to look like post banlist. So if you like this type of content, be sure to let me know by leaving a like, commenting, subscribing, because it really helps keep me motivated to keep posting videos like this, and it would really help the channel out. But with that being said, here we have 25 of what I believe will be the most played decks or the most relevant decks. Of course, I'm not covering every single possible deck that's competitive, but what I personally felt would be the 25 most competitive decks. So if I missed anything, let me know in the comments below. But with that being said, let's just get straight into it. So the very first deck I'm going to be talking about is Invoked. So Invoked didn't really get hit on this list aside from Dear Servant to 2 and Fusion Destiny to 2. So while they lost two very powerful, two of their most powerful spells, they literally just take out two cards from the main deck, they can put in like an extra hand trap or like an Upstart Goblin or something. It really just doesn't matter for the Invoke deck. I don't think they weren't playing Desires to begin with, so they don't lose much consistency there. They can still play cards like Pot of Prosperity. For that reason, I think they're definitely like a tier 1 deck, 100% for sure. Super versatile deck, super powerful deck, albeit I think it's like a little to the lower end of tier 1, but nonetheless a tier 1 deck. Next is Prank Kids. So Prank Kids is interesting. Nothing really changed for them on this list. In the last format, they weren't really doing that much either. They were like an okay deck, and I think that's going to kind of be the same for this format as well. I'm going to put them in tier 2. They're definitely like still a competitive deck they're definitely still competitive for sure. But I just think that a lot of the other decks have just started to like outclass it. And with Meow Moo still at 1, it's still kind of huge for the decks like Grind Game and stuff. So I would definitely just put Prank Kids down to tier 2, especially also because they kind of lose harder to the Scythe Lock. They don't really have a good way to play around it without hard drawing like non-engine cards like Forbidden Droplets, because well, if the opponent does the Scythe stuff in the standby, then you actually can't chain the fusion spell because the fusion spell is main phase only. So I'm gonna put that in tier 2. Next up is the Water Control Shark deck. This has actually been like a shockingly decent deck in my opinion. It has very good control cards. You can play cards like Gozen, and it puts up like a zombie world like Rivalry Lock, except with like Gozen and the Kraken instead. XYZ is probably, in my opinion, the second best extra deck summoning type behind Lynx, just because of access to a card like Zeus. It wasn't like, I didn't see that much representation last format. I think it's still like a decent deck. It's a rogue tier pick in my opinion. It can compete. I mean, going first, you have a 2-card combo that puts a Utopic Draco feature and double totally awesome. That's definitely not too bad of a combo if I do say so myself. The deck has decent plays to play around Nibiru because of totally awesome. They can bring it out with a card like Bahamut Shark under 5 summons, which is pretty strong, and of course the XYZ toolbox is very strong. However, I think this deck kind of needs to prove itself before I can put it higher. So for now, I'm going to put it in the rogue tier. Next up is Sword Soul. So Sword Soul on this list, all they lost was a copy of Arch Nemesis Protoss. Of course, deck doesn't need it. You can still play like pure Sword Soul with the 10E stuff. All it loses is a very, very powerful auto win condition versus some decks. That might sound huge, but to be honest, Sword Soul, instead of searching the spell out, they can just go for a card like Blackout to have a pop 2 on the opponent's turn, or they can search the spell as a follow-up for the next turn, because when you search Protoss off the spell, unless you hard draw like follow-up, you actually don't have plays after your board gets broken. So now that Protoss is gone, Sword Soul's deck's just gonna be super resilient. And for that reason, I think, honestly, I'm actually gonna have to put it in the best deck of the format just because its versatility. People have shown like Sword Soul 10E. You can play Sword Soul DPE still, that also works. It's just a super powerful deck, super consistent, and now it hasn't really lost anything. The only thing that's like preventing me from saying like, oh, definitively is the best deck of format, is the prevalence of Token Collector that's coming on the rise now because of the Brave tokens. People are going to be sliding Token Collector more often in my opinion, and Token Collector just happens to be a pretty good card against Sword Soul, so if you're a Sword Soul player, got to watch out for that. But other than that, I definitely think Sword Soul probably one of the best decks of the format, if not the best deck. Next up is Dinos. Dinos is always been a pretty cool deck. I mean, it's definitely competitive for sure. You can play scrap dinos or just pure like dinosaurs. I don't think there's anything particularly that they have to be super scared of this format. Like the Scythe pretty much does absolutely nothing to them. And they're actually one of the decks that can play through the Scythe really, really well, and even play it themselves if they choose. So I think Dinosaurs, being able to play through the Scythe and being a going second deck, they can play a lot of powerful going second cards like Lightning Storm, Forbidden Droplets, or whatever. I definitely think they're like top of tier 1.5, just barely below tier 1 in my opinion. They do suffer from some consistency issues, which I think prevents them from being that tier 1 deck. But other than that, they're definitely a very, very solid pick this format. It's just because, like I said, it can play through Scythe. Next up is Shaddolls. So like Shaddolls as in like Trap Shaddolls, Pure Shaddolls. Window's still a really powerful card. The deck can definitely also play through a card like Scythe really well. Just because you have quick play fusion spells like El Shaddol Fusion that allow you to actually fuse before the Scythe is able to resolve. Or even if Scythe resolves, you can set El Shaddol Fusion just fuse on your opponent's turn. So Scythe isn't that big of a deal for Shaddolls to deal with, and it has a very good grind game. So against like grindy matchups like Eldritch, it has access to cards like Nail Shaddol Aerial, has access to like all their traps, letting them recur their Shaddol monsters. And of course, Winda, like I said, still a very, very powerful card against a lot of the top decks out there. For that reason, I'll put it in like top of tier 2, just below tier 1.5. The problem with this deck is consistency. There are Shaddol, like the Shaddol cards themselves. If you don't draw the fusion spells with them, then they're not that great. Of course, you can splash something like the Nadir Servant Engine, but that's just got like slightly less consistent as well. So I'm gonna put Shaddolls at the very, very top of tier 2. They're like just barely below tier 1.5 in my opinion. Definitely a very solid pick if you want to play that deck. Next up is Heroes. So Heroes losing Fusion Destiny to 2 actually is pretty interesting because Fusion Destiny wasn't just making DPE in their deck. Fusion Destiny was actually like a one card starter. They could like start their whole combo with that, even if they don't summon DP, and then summon DP later on. So Heroes, I think Dark Law is still a really powerful card. A lot of these decks like struggle against Dark Law, especially like Eldritch, which people think are going to be more popular now because of the skill drain on limit. You can definitely have ways to beat the Eldritch deck with just Dark Law DPE. And of course, like I said, this deck can play DP very, very well, and DP is one of the most powerful cards in our format. For that reason, I think I'm gonna put them at like tier 2. They still like lose pretty hard to a card like Nibiru in my opinion, although I believe it's possible people are gonna be like side decking Nibiru because it's not the greatest against Dorsal Tenny. But then the fact that like Nibiru is just always going to come in like game 2 or game 3 does really hinder this deck because this deck doesn't have a good way to play on Nibiru, and in addition doesn't really have a good way to play through the Scythe Lock either, and I think those things are kind of limiting it in the tier 2 category right now. Like a lot of these other decks either have like better ways to play through the Scythe Lock, or like they're just resilient enough to actually be able to still do stuff like what if they get Scythe. While Heroes, like, they don't really have that option. But still, definitely not a bad deck. Next up is At Ignister. At Ignister hasn't been seeing that much play recently. I think it's for good reason. I don't think the deck's that great, honestly. It's definitely a rogue deck now, in my opinion. It puts up like big towers. But the thing is, that towers isn't like particularly hard for a lot of decks to out. For example, like your dinosaur matches can out it pretty easily. You have a searchable Kaiju. You have a lot of ways to get your monsters really, really big. In like Sword Soul with like Changing or something, and like in the Invoke deck, you can kind of just grind out your opponent even through the towers. So I just think a deck that just puts up a towers, like, it isn't super great. And of course, it does lose also to the Scythe Lock really, really hard. They don't really have plays through the Scythe Lock, so that's a pretty big issue. For that reason, we'll put it in Rogue. I could be wrong about this. I'm not super experienced with the deck, so maybe if one of you guys are an At Ignister player, you can convince me otherwise, but I think for now, it's pretty much a Rogue tier. Drytron, next up. Drytron lost Eva on this list, so now they don't have access to very consistently adding multiple fairies from their deck to their hand, and that pretty much makes it so their end board is a lot weaker, because without a copy of like the fairies in hand, your ultimateness just doesn't have negations. they're either gonna have to find another way, like to put up a very strong end board, which at that point, honestly, they might just become like a Scythe deck, where they like set up the Scythe lock, which is not bad because the Drytron cards themselves are still very powerful. You have access to very strong ritual monsters like the Draconids, and you have access to the XYZ toolbox, which gives you access to Zeus. And in addition, like I just said, you can play one of the most powerful combos this format with the Scythe and the DPE lock. So I think Drytron, honestly, like, they're still going to be like a decent deck. Just like, in my opinion, I'm putting them a little higher than I think they personally should be. But the Scythe lock is just so powerful, and the fact that this deck can play it pretty well, incorporate it really well into their engine, honestly still think this is going to be a decent deck. Like bottom tier 1.5, maybe top at tier 2. So definitely watch out for this deck. It's still able to like put out some plays with the ritual, like the big ritual monsters. It does a lot. It gains a lot of advantage, and of course it sets up the Scythe lock, which is huge. Next up is Eldritch. Eldritch, a lot of people were like, oh, this deck's gonna be broken now because triple skill drain. And while it is a really good card in the Eldritch deck, I just think this deck was always okay. It just never did anything particularly like well. You had to hard draw like really unsearchable traps for it to be really strong. You have to draw like floodgates. A lot of things have to go right for you when you're playing this deck. While Skill Drain is a really strong floodgate that will definitely help this deck out, I don't think it solves a lot of the deck's issues. So in my mind, I still think Eldritch is like a top of tier 2 deck. It's decent, but I just really don't think it's that great because a lot of people will always have back removal in their deck, and especially now, a lot of people I suspect will side cards like Cosmic Cyclone to beat Scythe, and Eldritch, Cosmic Cyclone gets rid of their grind game as well. So for that reason, put Eldritch at like the top of tier 2. It'll definitely be a good deck. You definitely can't just write it off, but I don't think it's like gonna do anything super impactful. Next up is Fluanderies. Fluanderies just got their new spell card in the new Battles of Chaos set, and this adds a lot of consistency to the deck, as it adds a lot of resilience to the deck as well, because you're able to play through cards like Veiler and Imperm just so much better, because you can chain it and get rid of remove your bird from the field, and now like, what are your opponents gonna do? You resolve your bird and you get a search off of this. So, and the fact that this deck just once you get going, like, you just full steam ahead. It's so hard to stop this deck once it gets its plays going. So now that it has 3 extra consistency cards, it's gonna help the deck a lot. You can still play cards like Extravagance, Nadir Servant if you really want to, because like I said, you only need 1 card to play. And it's so hard to stop this deck once it goes off. And the biggest part about this deck is it doesn't lose the Scythe. It doesn't lose the Scythe, and it has decent matchups into like the Eldritch deck. While it does lose to like Skill Drain, it's still actually able to have main deck outs to the Skill Drain, which is huge. So for that reason, I think Fluanderies is actually like top of tier 1.5, maybe like bottom tier 1. I just think this deck still needs a little bit of time to prove itself. It is unfortunately losing to cards like Lancia and Droll and Lockbridge, which I think will still be in people's side decks. Because there are a lot of decks that get hit by that. So there's quite a bit of hate for this deck out there, but with their new support cards, I definitely think they could be a very powerful contender in this format. And not to mention, they can still play the Wind Barrier statue, and Wind Barrier statue is a problem for a lot of decks. So Fluanderies, definitely top tier 1.5 in my opinion. Next up is Tri-Brigade. Tri-Brigade didn't really get hit at all this list, so you can still play it as like a pure deck. DP build has been running around. You technically lost like 1 Fusion Destiny. It's not a big deal. You were making Anaconda anyways to send it, so it doesn't really affect it at all. It's a very consistent deck. Tri-Brigades can still end on Revolt. Revolt's a very powerful card. While it does lose to a card like Scythe, it does have ways around it with, like I said, cards like Revolt. And you play a bunch of hand traps anyways to slow the game down, so I believe it has a decent matchup into those Scythe decks anyways. So for that reason, I'll put it at like the bottom of tier 1.5. It's a pretty decent deck in my opinion. Very competitive, and of course the Tri-Brigade engine is very splashable, which I'll get into with some of the other decks that you're going to see later on. Next up is Gren Maju. So Gren Maju actually, funnily enough, got hit kind of hard with like the Desires down to 1. Because Desires was not only like a consistency card for them, it was also a combo piece because it gets more cards banished. While it's definitely not the end of the world for the deck, you can play cards like Extravagance still, Prosperity if you really want to. I mean, Desires are just honestly the freest plus for this deck ever, because you essentially give your guy a 4k attack and you draw 2 cards, which is just absolutely insane. But now that Desires is gone, I mean, it doesn't really change much for the Grand Manju deck. They don't lose the Scythe either, which is great. So for that reason, honestly, I think they're one of the better rogue picks this format, excuse me. They can play into Scythe really well, and of course they can just still do their OTK just a little less consistently now with the hit of Desires. Next up is Pendulum. This is an interesting one. In all my tier lists before, I never really thought Pendulum was that great of a deck, but if you look at this format now, Pendulum is actually pretty scary. You got Astrograph Sorcerer back that allows them to do some more crazy combos, but the biggest thing is they can play the Scythe Lock. And the crazy thing about their Scythe Lock is, compared to something like Phantom Knights, for example, their Scythe Lock has negates behind it to back it up. So cards like Borreload Savage and Odd Eyes Vortex Dragon, those Omni negates to negate those cards that would negate the Scythe, it's just insane. And if you somehow have, like, I don't know, Forbidden Droplets sending all your monsters to like negate it, they have a card like Time Pendulum Graph as well to help the Scythe dodge the negation. So honestly, their Scythe is pretty much always going to resolve. Plus, they with a very strong resilient cards when going second. Like all the Magician cards actually have very, very good going second effects. I honestly think this deck is tier 1. This format, it's only going to be a matter of time before someone finds a way to really break this deck, in my opinion. Like I said, Scythe Lock going first can put up multiple negates, can play going second. There's not much more to say about this deck. This deck is I really think it's gonna do pretty well this format. The only reason I'm not saying it's like the best deck of the format is because going second into those like combo mirrors, I suspect if there's a card like Scythe involved, maybe a little difficult for them to play through. So definitely a tier 1 deck, lower tier 1 in my opinion, but still a tier 1, solid tier 1 deck nonetheless. Next up is Virtual World. So Virtual World pretty much traded in 2 copies of Desires for 1 copy of Emergency Teleport. So it really doesn't make too big of a difference to them. It's going to hit the consistency a tiny bit. And while it already struggled with consistency, this little bit of consistency, it isn't like the end of the world. Emergency Teleport to 3 is very strong, gives them a lot of extenders, helps them play through boards going second as well. Not much to say there. Virtual World, I think, always has been, pretty much always will be like a solid tier 1.5 deck. You're able to put up Crystal Wing, you have in-engine outs to like those annoying floodgates like Skill Drain or whatever, and you have space to play quite a few defensive cards in your deck as well. So you can play like Gamma, Imperm, Veiler, stuff like that, just because you have a lot of space in your deck to do it. So yeah, I definitely think Virtual Worlds are a solid tier 1.5 deck. Next up is Altergeist. Altergeist, I don't remember the interaction between Protocol and Skill Drain, but I think they can probably, they probably wouldn't play it anyways, and for that, like, nothing really changed for them on this list either. So I think, honestly, like, Altergeist is still like a rogue deck. It's decent, I suppose. It can definitely compete with some other decks in the format, but I really don't think Altergeist is like that great at all. There's a lot of back row hate. There's a lot of hate for it, and like Eldritch, it kind of needs to have a lot of things go right for them. And the thing with, I think I would prefer Eldritch over this is because Eldritch actually has a better grind game than Altergeist, but I could be wrong. Maybe Altergeist is better than Eldritch. Honestly, I'll put it in like bottom tier 2. Just because with the new cards, like I think Poo Query, it gives them a lot higher ceiling turn 1. It can actually help them do some stuff that isn't just set traps. Next up is Sky Striker. So the Sky Striker DPE deck, I mean, very much still alive. It lost 1 copy of Fusion Destiny, not a big deal. It still has the same strengths as it did last format. Very powerful DP access to a card like DPE while having a very grindy engine like Sky Strikers. And the best thing about this deck is it really doesn't lose the Scythe. So for that reason, I'm going to put it up at the top of tier 1.5. I personally believe in this deck quite a bit. It can play those powerful floodgates like there can be only one. It can play through Scythe. It can play Scythe itself. And it has access to Destroy Phoenix Enforcer. as well as the powerful Sky Striker engine. So definitely a very strong tier 1.5 deck in my opinion. Next up is Bird Up. This was an interesting one. I did think about it for a while in my head, theorizing some like where the combo would go, and ultimately I felt that Bird Up was still very much alive. With some work on your end board, just changes a little bit. You're gonna go more for the Tri-Brigade part of your deck now, ending on Appaloosa Revolt. So essentially it becomes like a Tri-Brigade, pure Tri-Brigade deck with a higher ceiling because of the birds. The birds give you more fodder in the graveyard while giving you access to the XYZ toolbox. You can play something like Sylvan Princess Sprite to replace the extra copies of a Recital Starling that you lost. And while you don't have to go to like the Utopic Draco feature now, the fact that the birds give you more consistency as well, because you can search Nerval, and that's kind of like the thing that like bridges the two engines together, was the Recital Starling. You can search that Nerval to have access to your Tri-Brigade engine from just your bird engine, or vice versa, with the Tri-Brigade searching a copy of like Barrel Canary off of Sure Egg or something. Which, speaking of which, I still think Ensemble Robin is one very, very powerful card. And for that reason, I'm going to put Bird Up at like... Maybe it's just me being a little biased, but I really do believe combo decks in these type of combo decks. I'll put them at the bottom, like the very bottom of tier 1, below Invoked and Pendulum. I think they definitely still have potential. Someone just needs to find like a new combo to break them, and honestly, I think they'll be really strong. Moving on to the next deck, we have Rockets. Rockets Dragon Link, I should say, is still a really strong deck. They got Destrudo back, which is very interesting. Honestly, think Destrudo isn't gonna like break the deck, but it's a very, very nice addition to the deck. And of course, before, it had some very strong plays to begin with. It was very consistent. It can play a lot of hand traps. It can play well into back row, going first or second. So it's just a very solid tier 1.5 deck in my opinion. Definitely top of tier 1.5. It's just on the fringe of being like tier 1. I think there's like these other combo decks just slightly outclass it, but it's still a very, very strong deck nonetheless. Next up is Phantom Knight. This is interesting because Phantom Knights have access to the Scythe very, very easily. And in addition, with the new Brave token stuff, I think Phantom Knights are actually going to be a tier 1 deck. They're going to be a very strong tier 1 deck because they have, like I said, Scythe, they have access to the XYZ toolbox, so they can make Zeus. They have a very strong grind game with all the Phantom Knight cards. They don't essentially lose to Dark Ruler, lose to like Dark Ruler stuff. 1, because of Scythe. 2, because they have interruptions in Fogblade. And 3, they can still play Fusion Destiny, which is just honestly insane. They have so many powerful engines. Like the Brave engine gives them so much consistency and power. The Fusion Destiny engine is still a super powerful engine that they can incorporate into their decks very, very, very easily. Even though they're locked into darks, well, you can still summon DP because it is a dark. And of course, like I said, the Phantom Knights stuff is just so strong. Honestly, think this deck is going to be one of the better decks this format. Definitely a tier 1 deck in my opinion. Next up is B Troopers. So B Troopers, you may not think they got hit, but they did lose 1 Fusion Destiny. And B Troopers, to my knowledge, was a deck that actually made Anaconda less often. It can make it, but most of the time it just relied on hard drawing it and playing with the B stuff from there. I personally I know this deck has topped like multiple YCSs before, and that's very impressive really, but I don't like personally believe in this deck that much. I don't think it's like that insane of a deck. I think it's just like a Fusion Destiny deck with a very, very like strong engine that can play, because they have a lot of space to play like defensive cards, which is nice, but honestly don't believe they're like insane or anything. And now that they lost a little bit of consistency with the Fusion Destiny, I definitely think that puts them at like the top of tier 2. Still a decent deck, but I don't think it's gonna like shift the format or anything. Next up is Salamangreat. Salamangreat is okay. It got like Circle back to 2. I don't think that's gonna like make the deck that much more insane. It's just like 1 card they get back. It's a nice consistency boost, but they did lose the Desires as well. So they traded in 2 Desires for 1 copy of Circle, which is fine. But even before that, like Salamangreat just wasn't doing that much. They're like always an okay deck. Like they can play a lot of defensive cards, a lot of hand traps. But other than that, I don't think that there's much going for them. Their boards are very mediocre going first. It's like one one negate and like 2 pops at most, maybe a hand trap or whatever. But the deck also just doesn't play going second that great. And for that reason, I'm just put in the rogue tier. It's a decent deck, but I don't think it's gonna be it stands up to some of the other decks on this list. Next up is Lunalight. This one I'm actually really excited for. I played Lunalights when they were actually meta in like 2019 when Tiger was at 3, and oh boy, that deck felt so good to play. You can like do Tiger so many times, bringing back monsters for free rank 4s, which is one of the best ranks in the game. It's rank 4 toolbox is probably the best in the game, and now that you have access to cards like Zeus, you can play the Tri-Brigades in here or play this as a pure deck. There are a lot of very, very good ways for you to go about building this deck now. Because one single Tiger, like it may be like, oh, well, it's at 1. How often are you going to draw it? Well, actually, there are a lot of cards in the Lunalight archetype that help you get to it. So cards like Lunalight Perfume, Lunalight Serenade Dance, and Foolish Burial Goods. Those are all very powerful ways very consistent ways, I should say, you can get to your Lunalight Tiger. And the fact that like Tiger just adds a whole new like dimension to Lunalights, it lets you do those like loops again and bring out so many monsters. Pairing it with the Tri-Brigades as well, honestly, that puts them right next to Tri-Brigades in tier 1.5 in my opinion. I believe very highly in this deck. It does have its issues. Like I said, playing to Scythe is still an issue for it, but I think it's one of like it's a pretty decent combo deck that you definitely should not overlook. Okay, so moving on to our second last deck on the list, it's gonna be Thunder Dragon. The reason I'm even putting Thunder Dragon in here is because Fairy Tale Snow came back. If you guys aren't aware, all the Thunder Dragons get their effects when they're banished, and Fairy Tale Snow banishes it very, very readily while acting as a disruption. So not only do you disrupt your opponent on their turn, but you also are able to trigger your Thunder Dragon effects and get so many pluses off of that. I thought that was pretty cool, and while I think Thunder Dragons is like playable as like a 60 card combo deck with like the Chaos Creator, Snow and stuff like that, I just wanted to put this on the radar just so you guys are aware this is a possible deck that you guys can try out. It's definitely a rogue tier without Colossus. I think it still doesn't do too much to the meta. Definitely just an okay pick. And finally, Live Twin / Evil Twin. This has always just been like a mid-range like combo control deck. Has some pretty decent one-card combos. You can play a lot of defensive cards, which is why I'm even like considering it as like a decent deck to begin with. You can play a lot of defensive cards, and so that means your opponent's probably not getting to Scythe while they're playing against this deck, because this deck is just like a one-card combo deck with a bunch of defensive cards. I think this deck is okay. It doesn't do it with Trouble Sunny now. It has something good to end on with a lot of follow-up. I just think it's a solid tier 2 deck. It's decent at, like I said, it controls the game, and from there you can make a bunch of link plays into like access code or something later to kill your opponents. So definitely not too bad of a deck, if I do say so myself. Alright, so that's gonna do it for me, guys. Let me know what you thought of this tier list. Like I said, these are just my initial thoughts. I could be completely wrong. The meta could turn out completely differently, so please keep that in mind before commenting. These are my opinions and my opinions only. Like I said, I could be completely wrong, but let me know what you guys thought about it in the description below. Leave a like, comment, subscribe, and with that being said, I will see you guys soon. Take care.